Mirë se erdhët në Public Square. Unë jam Ditmir Bushati. I ftuari im i sotëm është Wolfgang Merkel. Ai është profesor i shkencave politike në Universitetin e Humboldtit në Berlin dhe njëkohësisht në Berlin Center of Social Sciences, me cilin do të flasim për gjendjen e demokracisë kudo në botë, por kryesisht në kontinentin tonë. Dear Wolfgang, welcome to Public Square. What is the state of democracy in Europe and in the Western family of nations? Is there a crisis of democracy? There has been theories about the end of history. First, it has been mentioned by Hegel, then by Karl Marx, and at the beginning of the 90s by Fukuyama, in very different historical contexts. What's your view about the state of democracy nowadays?
If we talk about the state of democracy in singular, we should be very cautious. Even there are flooding around theories of crisis of democracy. I don't follow this path because we have to acknowledge there is a difference between, let's say, Denmark and Serbia, Finland and Albania, and even between France and the United States of America. Since I am looking from a comparative view on democracies, I'm very cautious to use the singular. But we have to know what we mean by democracy, and we have to know what we mean by crisis. Democracy, we do have many definitions. I would like to systematize these two definitions in a minimalist concept of democracy, a medium range concept of democracy, and a maximalist. The minimalists are simply free and equal elections. Fairness is another point of view. I don't consider most of the elections not very fair in many democracies. So this is the minimalist concept which we have learned from the great economist Joseph Schumpeter. There is a mid-range, and this is my favorite concept of democracy. And the mid-range concept means free and equal and general elections on the one side, plus rule of law and checks and balances on the other side. If you are a convinced social democrat, this is even not enough. So then you are talking about a maximalist concept, and this means free elections, rule of law, plus some sort of social justice and fairness. So the outcome of the democratic process is important. Very briefly, on crisis, we should distinguish between an acute crisis, where we have to be afraid of a transformation from democracy to an autocratic regime, as it was in Germany, 1932, in Italy when Mussolini came along in 1922. This is an acute crisis. And then we are talking very often about a latent crisis. This means there is an erosion and regression in the quality of democracy. And we, the community of democracy researchers, are very often using this latent concept of crisis, which, by the way, is also not very well defined.
What's your feeling when you read the data provided by Freedom House on the state of democracy, when you speak about these latent crises? Because there we see a backsliding within EU family, within Western Hemisphere, within Southeast Europe.
I agree on this perspective, and you are using now an additional term, backsliding, erosion, regression, and sometimes it's even used autocratization, meaning there is a loss of quality in democracy, but not necessarily a transition to an autocratic regime. Since the year 2008, we have a slow decline even in the 30 best democracies of Western Europe and North America. So there is a loss of quality, and especially not the quality in free and general election, but very much on the liberal component of democracy I was talking about before, meaning rule of law and checks of balances. And if we talk about checks of balances, very often we see deficits in the independence of the judiciary. And this is what we are observing, even if politicians are elected by acceptable free elections. It might mean after a while the elected president or the elected prime minister sometimes tends to govern in an authoritarian manner. We call this sometimes electoral authoritarianism.
And what should we do more in this respect? Because we see this battle for democracy with people protesting from Israel to Georgia, basically in different bits of the world. Is it still in fashion to fight for democracy? Can we take democracy for granted? Can we expect this minimalist approach that we go to the polls and then we trust politicians to have free hands and decide about us?
No, history tells us we should not have too much trust in politicians. Trust is also a very interesting concept. We should trust to some extent those we vote into power, but then we should have a democratic distrust, meaning we have to control it. And we cannot only control it each 4 years in general elections, there must be controls in between. I was talking about the judiciary. I can talk about the parliament, who is the highest norm-setting institution in democracy. But you are talking, if you are talking about Georgia and talking about Israel, and I would immediately add Poland and Hungary, there we have a civil society protesting against the attacks of the elected government on the independence of the judiciary. And all what we know from our crisis studies is that the first attacks of elected but authoritarian inclined politicians, that they attack the independence of the judiciary and the media. And this is very often where the virus of authoritarianism spread across the country. So again, civil society, a mobilized civil society, belongs to the basics of a working democracy as well.
Talking about Southeast Europe, we lack this, let's say, strong culture of building democratic and resilient institutions, and we have always seen the path towards EU membership as an incentive for building strong democratic and resilient institutions. How do you assess the state of democracy within the European Union, and how this is being projected also in our corner of Europe?
If you have 27 states with different interests, with different histories, with even different sorts of government, then it's extremely difficult to find common decisions to react to a multiple series of crises we are confronted with. Having said this, I would like to state the European integration is a fantastic idea, overcoming these national borders. However, it has a price. And the price is, to some extent, less democracy on the supranational sphere of the European Union. If, for example, I would compare the democratic state of the European Union on the one side and democracy, let's say, in the North European countries on the other side, there is no doubt these countries are better equipped with democracy than the European Union. The Commission does not have a direct, the European Commission does not have a direct legitimation by voters. It is not very transparent. Nobody or let's say 95% in Germany of the German citizens do not know very much about the European Parliament. They don't know the parliamentarians there, maybe one or two. And I even asked my students, who is representing you in the European Parliament? Students of political science. So out of 65 raise the hands, and they know who the parliamentarian representative is. And then I asked them, how do you know? And they responded, because we work for them. So there is not a clear accountability, there is less transparency, there is less legitimacy.
What is the war in Ukraine telling us about the state of democracy? Is it compatible to be nationalist and at the same time fighting for democracy, for an open society?
Ukraine is trying to defend itself, and this is its right to do it. And there's even the international legal obligation and possibilities that other countries support Ukraine. However, to support Ukraine with weapons, what all Europe and especially the United States do, have always to keep in mind there is a thin line which should not be crossed in order to escalate the situation, which cannot be controlled anymore. And there is still a risk of nuclear escalation as well. So it tells us it is a war launched by Russia, and I hesitate to some extent. This is also a war between autocracy on the one side, Russia, clear, and Ukraine on the other side. If you look to your Freedom House or to this Freedom and Varieties of Democracy in 2021, just before the war, Ukraine was in this quality of democracy below Hungary, visibly below Hungary on a rank such as 110. So 109 countries had better democracies. But there was the attempt, and still is, to create a democracy, and it will not be so easy to create a blooming, flourishing democracy after the war.
Speaking about democracies and autocracies, what is your impression in dealing with pandemics and also climate emergency. So, what are the differences that you have noticed so far?
And there is no clear empirical evidence that democracies perform better than autocracies. But there's also no evidence that autocracies perform better, because one important country would be China, and we don't have valid data on China. Even we don't have the best data on the United States, on Germany. It's a kind of data chaos. One, we have to say, the state was not very much prepared to follow an evidence-based policy. An evidence-based policy means we should have better data. This is something many countries now engaging in. If we look to climate change, there is an interesting debate, even among progressive forces, that we should not be too keen on all these democratic procedures. We should not pay too much attention to all these democratic veto players you have in a democratic regime. We should look simply to solve this problem of mankind, to stop global warming. So there is a certain tendency, very surprisingly, a certain tendency of these progressive people and intellectuals which argue less democracy would or might mean more effective policies. I don't believe it, because it's not only about fast decision-making, it's also about having intelligent decisions, sustainable decisions. And democracy can one thing much better than autocratic regime. They learn. They have these feedback mechanisms to learn much more than autocratic regimes. So in the long run, I think democracies will perform better, but no doubt the stopping the global warming will be decided in China, India, and the United States, basically. And as good as Germany, as Europe would perform, Europe is only responsible for roughly 8% of the greenhouse emissions. It doesn't make such a big difference. It's China, India, Latin America.
From the democracy perspective, do you fear technology and artificial intelligence? As a progressive, do you think that such an important issue can be regulated only by three big companies, namely Google, Meta, and Microsoft?
No, I don't think this can be led only with the competence of the big IT players, Google, Microsoft, and so forth. There must be a public state-oriented regulation, and even a supranational regulation to some extent as well. The European Union, we were talking about, would be quite be able and equipped to do this regulation. The other question is whether the countries will follow. But what we see here is a typical problem democracies have. These technological innovations, economic innovations are much faster than political innovation. So there is a time gap. The one is the empire of speed we see in technological development, but democracy needs time. If you take time away from democratic decision-making, it means less democracy. And this is not, it would be a slippery slope. But again, we must have a regulation, but I'm not so optimistic that we get a very efficient one. Capitalism is, to some extent, more innovative, more faster, but it creates big problems on the other side, and a democracy comes always a bit late to try to regulate it.
Wolfgang, you are an influential mind and voice in Germany and more specifically within social democratic thinking. What are the main challenges social democrats and progressive politicians, activists and forces are facing in relation to the democracy challenges we have been discussing?
There is one point which is typically social democratic, where we should look closer. Of course, global warming, pandemic, migration, these are general problems also social democracy has. But a specific one is inequality. Inequality of the socioeconomic status, of income, and now it comes, the term, inequality of life chances. Social democrats have not only to redistribute resources and income, they have to redistribute cognitive resources by education, education, education. So this is one important thing, because we know that if people do not have sufficient resources, material resources, they will not participate in politics. And we have not only then an economic inequality, we have a political inequality as well. We had all these identity discourses during the last 10 years about sexual identity, gender identity, ethnic identity. These are important topics. What we see now in Europe, in Western Europe as well, it is a return of the material disputes. So with high inflation, with high socioeconomic insecurity, the preferences of the people now rank economic matters very, very high at the first top. So it is back to the question, and this might be a good ground for social democracy to come back as well from a long, long lingering decline during the last 30 years.
In Albania, we've just passed local government elections, and I know in the past you have been involved into these projects of citizens' assemblies. Can you elaborate a little bit these concepts?
There's a weakness of democratic representation. Therefore, citizens are demanding a more direct say in politics. And there are basically two very important lines. The one are referenda. The people decide directly on political matters. And the other one are citizen assemblies. I'm a bit scared about referenda, because we are living now in polarized societies, and referenda are a super majoritarian instrument where the winner takes it all. 50.1% are sufficient and 49.9% are out of the game. And citizen assemblies think different. They think about randomly selected groups from society by a lottery. Only gender, age, education should be equally represented, but On the other side, everything else is randomly selected. These are groups of around 100 citizens. They meet 15 times during an average span of time of a year. And they talk, discuss on one topic. They get informed by experts about these matters. They learned about these matters. They discussed it with the experts. And very important, they are chaired by a neutral professional moderator. And the moderator has to enable that every person, each person of this group has to participate equally, not the lawyers, not the professors, the judges, but also the garbage collectors and the cashiers at the supermarket. This is not an easy task. But there is an observation by independent groups which observe the moderator as well, because he could manipulate it. They came up with a recommendation. The recommendation is different from a referenda decision. The referenda decision is directly valid. And the citizen assemblies are giving a recommendation, and the parliament does not have to take it over, but it has to discuss it. And if it does not take it over completely or part of it, it has to publicize the reasons for it. So there is a link between the two. The citizen assemblies have to be completely independent, but they have to be linked with parliaments as well. Otherwise, they would not come into high politics. They would not have the chance that their recommendations were taken seriously and maybe transformed in decision. And we have many countries, not only on the central state level as in Ireland, we had it in Canada on electoral system, in France on ecological matters, and you can have it on a municipal level as well. So, for example, Rijeka, and I was with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation involved in the advising the mayor of Rijeka. They install now a citizen assembly on the reform of public administration.
What is the latest book you have read that you could share with us?
In my area, a book which can also read not only by academics, but by non-academic people as well, is How Democracies Die. Two colleagues from Harvard, Steve Levitsky and Daniel Seiblatt, have written it, and it was also on the preference list of Obama, I heard. At the moment, I read a book on Willy Brandt, the big figure of Social Democratic Party, written by his son. So you get the two aspects. His son, Peter Brandt, who is an historian, and he has parts of the book on the personality, the person of Willy Brandt, which was not an easy one, and the politician. We know more about it. And the combination of both is what makes the book to read worthwhile.
Wolfgang, it was a true honor and pleasure to have you on Public Square.
No, it was my honor and pleasure to talk to you and hopefully to a wider audience in your country as well.